The aim of this presentation is the following: to examine two concepts that are, in my understanding, fundamental for the study of culture, especially from the perspective of semiotics. These two concepts are the concept of text, and in particular, the concept of cultural text, which I will explain later, and the concept of the human face. So first of all, one may wonder what texts have to do at all with the study of the face. So first of all, let me clarify from the outset the scope of my inquiry. It is not my contention in this paper to argue for the textual nature of the human face, that is to say, to consider face as a text. Although there can be found very good examples of the face as a literary motif. By looking at the history of literature, as well as at the history of narratology, one can indeed find very good examples of the cross-pollination between, on one hand, physiognomy as a field of study, and on the other hand, arts and literature. This point was well documented by Jason Yarwood, by John Graham, and by Tytler, just to mention a few of the scholars that dealt with this subject. An example of a textual and narrative dimension of face in literature is physiognomy as a literary technique used for character descriptions and for fictional characterization. Yet, if this is not enough to contend with, there is a whole literary genre of late Victorian fiction, which is called physiognomic, in which the main focus of the novel is, in fact, the connection between the face and the body and the character itself. So the whole novel in this specific genre called physiognomic focuses on this link, on this connection. So this would perhaps account for speaking of the human face in terms of its textual nature. And this is absolutely a very intriguing and fascinating way to approach the subject. However, my contention in this paper is not to unpack the textual meaning of the face, nor to discuss this specific literary genre. So as this will be clear in what follows, my concern is of a rather different nature. So the thrust of this paper is to conceive of the study of face from the perspective of cultural texts, without, however, positing an isomorphism between these two concepts, face and texts. Now, a few introductory notes on the conception of face as an object of study. It is rather commonsensical to speak of the human face as having a host of different meanings, from a biological to a cultural meaning. Needless to say, also the different elements within the human face, from smiles to eye colors, to wrinkles, to noses, they all take on different meanings in different contexts, as anthropological and ethnographical evidence has shown. The central role of the human face as a scientific subject is evident both in the exact sciences, such as medicine, evolutionary biology, and genetics, as well as in the sciences of man and society, such as cultural anthropology, history, and psychology. Whilst the exact sciences deal with the human face in its organic dimension, the study of its biological functions, its origin, its evolution, and the genetic architecture of the face. The human sciences deal with the social and the cultural functions, with values and the implications that face possess. Each culture elaborates a specific set of values, which tends to vary across space and time, and of which the human face, coupled with a variety of many representations, constitutes an integral part. The sciences of man and society thus study the human face on the basis of representations that culture itself has handed down in its social imagery. Portraits, self-portraits, drawings, caricatures, statues, and pictures, they all make up the visual repertoire of representations, some of which have a focus on the face. So given the centrality of this theme, it's not surprising to find a wide range of depictions in history that portray faces. However, if we take up a more holistic approach to the study of face, as the one in particular of the semiotics of culture, then we must think of representations, and in particular of representations of faces, enmeshed in a system, enmeshed in a system of system. This said, I would have some methodological concern, first of all. So my main concern would be first of a methodological nature. First of all, how do we as analysts and as investigators of culture tackle the study of faces and face aesthetics from a cultural perspective in the various forms and manifestations across time and space? What are the aspects that we need to pay attention to? What are the research units that we are dealing with, and how do we define them? How can these research units be identified and studied appropriately? So there are several approaches one can take, but perhaps one way to go would be to take up the issue of the study of faces within the confines and within the domain of the study of texts. Hence the question, which is more of a hypothesis really, of whether it is possible to conceive of faces as cultural texts, so faces thought of as cultural texts, which credits the title of my talk. So, can we conceive of representations of faces within the conception of cultural texts? And if so, what are the benefits and shortcomings stemming from this theoretical stance? This point would lead me to the next section of my presentation, which sketches out a short outline of what this term refers to, in which scholarly tradition the concept was rooted, and what are the main features of cultural texts, how it operates within the system of culture. This point will be disposed of in a few minutes. Before I go on to a brief discussion of what cultural texts are, another aspect needs to be attended to. This has to do with the difference between organic phase, which no doubt plays a pivotal role in the functioning of the Umwelt of all human beings, and also in some other non-human animals. However, you may agree with me that there is also a representational element of the human face when it is considered as an object of study. And this aspect, I argue, that should not be overlooked. Most of the time, unless we engage in a physiological or in a biological study of the organic phase, we as researchers, as investigators of cultural phenomena, we engage in representations or simulacra of the face, with all the heavy theoretical baggage that such concepts are loaded with. Nonetheless, such representations are exchanged, they are stored, they are valued in various forms, from selfies in the internet to emojis, to the family portraits hanged on walls in family houses as a relic or as a memento. Such representations thus are exchanged through various channels and with different forms of expressions. These representations are therefore a sort of a net, a sort of a system, a mishmash of texts that, although separate, they can be looked as a whole, as a sort of visual repertoire. So no doubts, representation can be valued, they can also be preserved, but mind you, they also can be neglected, they can be ostracized, they can be completely erased, forgotten, they can be destroyed, in fact. At this junction, yet another point in my understanding requires further qualification. In fact, an important corollary of this discussion about representation of faces has to do with the distinction between analogical and digital codification, which accounts for two different modalities of decoding the information we have received as organisms operating in a given environment. The distinction between analogic and digital codification is applicable to the whole spectrum of the information we have gathered, and also the information we gather from the perception of human faces is not an exception to this rule. This yields to a division, to a distinction between, on one hand, analog faces, and on the other hand, between digital representation of faces. When we discuss faces, let's say in its organic meaning, as well as when we talk about the human face in concrete interactions and in concrete human relations, we are dwelling in the realm of analogical codification. To borrow a definition which was sketched out by the scholars Rouge and Keyes, then analogical codification constitutes a series of symbols that in their proportions and relations are similar to the thing, to the idea, or to the event which they stand. Whilst analogical codification deals with the continuous functions, digital codification is based on discrete step intervals. Therefore, the organic phase as embedded in a network of nonverbal communication, what we experience every day when we interact face-to-face, is an analogic codification device. But when we are discussing representations, then we are dealing with something different. And this is particularly important when we discuss digital representation of faces. So this is a point worth pondering, in my opinion. We have gone from an analog society to a digital society, where much of their communication has become electronic, as this very symposium testifies. This said, and given this background, I now should go on to the next section of my talk. So I should go on qualifying the technical term which I used in the title of this paper, which is cultural text, sometimes called also culture text. This is indeed a technical term which is rooted in a particular school of thought, namely the semiotics of culture, also well known as the Tartu Moscow semiotic school. So the term cultural text stems from the terminological toolkit of Yuri Lotman and his colleague, Alexander Piatigorsky, as well as all the members of the group. The concept of cultural text in its full-fledged formulation was described in full in a text published in 1973, well known to the scholars of semiotics. It was simultaneously published in Russian and in English, and the title is the Thesis on the Semiotic Study of Cultures. This is a very dense text and is considered the manifesto of the school, as well as it marks the birth of a new field of study that back to the 70s was the semiotics of culture. So from this very sophisticated text, I will extract only one toolkit, only one concept, which is the concept of cultural text. This was defined in the thesis of the 1973 as the fundamental concept of modern semiotics. And also it was regarded as the basic significant unit of cultural semiotic systems. One of the questions that arise when we speak of texts, and in particular of cultural texts, is whether basically the term texts can be referred to both verbal communication or we can also include also non-verbal communication. So one preliminary question would be whether under the rubric of texts we refer only to verbal communications or whether they also include non-verbal communications. So we can state without hesitations that within the range of so-called cultural texts, then we can include in the same basket both verbal texts as well as non-verbal texts and behavior. So also the whole repertoire of visual images, of visual texts can be included. Seen from this perspective, one can grasp the difference between the narrow notion of linguistic text and the broader one, which is a semiotic conception of text. Now, what it is important for my presentation is that 10 years before the publication of the thesis, there was published an article by Alexander Piatigorsky in which he singled out three main features of the cultural texts, which I show you in this following slide. So according to Piatigorsky, text has these three fundamental characteristics. A text must have a syntactic sphere, so it must be spatially fixed. So in an optical way, in an acoustical way, or in other fashion. The cultural text has also a pragmatic sphere, which is necessary for the communication of the texts as an intentional communication, and then the cultural text also has a semantic aspect to it. But I would put, for the time being, the characteristic B and C in brackets, and I would mainly focus on one particular detail of this definition of cultural texts. So of these three aspects of the text, I will focus only on the first one. This may look like a tiny, insignificant detail, so much so that it was in fact almost completely disregarded. So the concept of text is welded with the expression of the text in a particular system of science. It is very important for my talk and for the study that I want to pursue on the representations of faces that Lotman and Piatigorsky used the term fixation in order to explain this specific characteristic of cultural texts. So the element of fixation is important and in very simple terms has to do with the notion of the material aspect of the text. In order to be fixed in time and in space, a cultural text needs to be fixed in a particular form through a very particular material of expression. So the element of fixation in a material form is not a mere corollary, but it is something that is required for a cultural text to be called as such. In this sense, the cultural concept of text is different from the linguistic notion of text. The sole linguistic expression is not sufficient for a portion of language to become a text in a given culture. The line of demarcation between linguistic messages circulating in a society and those messages regarded as cultural texts is that cultural texts have something more to it. Lotman writes the following, that there is a group of texts within culture which reveals features of a supplementary expression, which is significant for the given system of culture. This point is worth pondering. Culture establishes the value of texts of a message, which can be a linguistic expression, but also an artifact or an object, on the basis of a supplementary signification, which is granted to some messages, but not to all of them. Such a supplementary signification is achieved through an intensification of the expression, or to borrow a terminology which was given by Maurizio Grande, a surplus of expression. So by means of which the cultural function of a text is fixed in a material of expression. We may now offer some illustrations of these very abstract concepts. So a good example, which is given both by Yuri Lotman and Alexander Piatigorsky in his text of 1962, which then was taken up by the scholars in the following up articles called Text and Function, then they provide the following example, that is the fixation of texts engraved in stone or metal. So if we take a look at records of the human face in the history of art, we will not be surprised to find such like examples. If we take a look at Egyptian art, for instance, it was very persistent on personal identity, as it is apparent from the abundance of face of individual portrayals. The face images in Egyptian art were indeed engraved in stone, and they were represented as indestructible monuments and everlasting images to preserve the personal identity of the pharaoh forever. Thus, stone sculptures in Egyptian time is quite a good example of how a cultural text is fixed in a particular material that constitutes, in fact, a surplus, an intensification of what before we referred to as expression of the cultural text, so the material. Along the same lines, you may think of kings, faces of kings and queens and emperors that were indeed depicted on coins that were made with very valuable materials like gold or silver. Along the same lines, what is written on very valuable surfaces, for example, silk or parchment, is somewhat different from what is written on simple paper. Hence, we have an opposition between valuable and non-valuable texts which are circulating in a given community. Also, if you think of what is written on letters, which then afterwards can be destroyed, and what is written on an album, you may think of a family photo album, then you may understand the difference between what is intended to be preserved, an album, and what intended to be destroyed, like just a letter. Along the same lines, you may think of Greek arts. The Greeks used, for instance, bronze and copper in order to depict their sculptures in their given culture. This is another exemplification in the Benevento head of how the use of a specific material of expression has given a surplus of value to a given cultural text in that specific culture and society. So now I wrap up and I go to my conclusions. These perspectives of understanding artifacts and also artifacts related to their representations of faces within the realm of a semiotics of culture and within the confines of cultural texts then leads to two important conclusions, in my opinion. The first conclusion is that cultural texts have particular values attached to them. Thus, there is a valuative aspect which is linked to messages that are regarded as cultural texts by a given community. These values can be framed according to the opposition given above, just as a way of example: valuable versus non-valuable, preservation versus destruction, memory between forgetting, eternal versus transitory. The second point, which is worth registering, is that this leads to a sort of understanding of cultural values in terms of a continuum, as a sort of a scale where there is a hierarchy of texts with different values attached to them. So we could think of a sort of continuum or a sort of degrees of cultural values, which are based on the functions of texts and the systems used to express those texts. I now go to the very last conclusion of my paper. So within the transition from oral culture to written culture, oral messages have lost their status of cultural texts. And indeed, the graphic fixation was the way to give a message the value of a cultural text. But yet another leap occurred when we have gone from the written culture to the printed culture. And yet another shift has already occurred now when we have gone from the printed culture to the digital culture. So my hypothesis, which should be indeed further elaborated and should be indeed tested empirically, is that with the emergence of digital culture, the systems of values anchored in the past to certain cultural texts have been completely flipped over. This shift has already occurred with the invention of radio and television. As a result of the development of this technology, the necessity of a text to be anchored on a very specific material of expression has been lost. The loss of the material expression of cultural texts has now reached its pinnacle with the era of internet and with the era of digital and electronic communication. My hypothesis, which should be tested empirically, would be that with the passage from the written society, so from the printed society to the digital one, basically we have experienced a new leap in the human consciousness, which would also result into a loss of expressions of cultural texts. So whilst in the past, this way of expressing through the materiality of an artifact was pretty much marked in the digital era, then probably this distinction cannot be drawn anymore. And so we have a challenge to face as well as a course